April 2021, the west end of Big Bend National Park in Texas. Our drive here from the east end of the park was only a little over an hour, and we picked BJ's RV Park as a place to stay. So this is our first day on the west end of Big Bend National Park, and since it didn't take us very long to set up, we decided to spend it by going to the nearest town to BJ's RV Park, which is Terralingua. BJ's RV Park, just like every other park in this area, is just hard-packed desert dirt. There is no concrete pads out here, and really, you don't need them. Once we cleared the bumpy driveway of BJ's RV Park and finally get up to the main road, it's a very short 2 to 3 mile drive into the town of Terlingua. Terralingua is a small town, no more than about a mile to get from one side to the other. As you turn off the main road to head into town, the first thing you notice is the High Sierra Bar and Grill. Janet and I made this place our regular stop every day after hiking. Just a couple of 100 yards past the Sierra Bar and Grill is a nice Mexican restaurant. Janet and I never ate there, but the food has to be good since there was always a crowd out there when it was opened. Just another couple of 100 yards past that, and you're in the Terralingua ghost town proper. Terralingua ghost town isn't so much a ghost town as it is the old abandoned part of Terralingua. It's really just a large grouping of old abandoned stone buildings back from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Since this part of the town is abandoned, you can freely walk through the ruins and explore to your heart's content. What's interesting though is that some of these old ruins are not actually fully abandoned. Some of these old buildings look like they've had modern buildings added onto them and people still actually live there. Next to the old abandoned town is the original cemetery, and it's still used today. Moving another couple of 100 yards down the road, you come to the Starlight Theater and the old trading post. The trading post has a large porch in front of it, and usually you can find locals gathering there and just getting together and playing some music. Unfortunately, because of COVID, that just wasn't happening this year. Next to the trading post is the Starlight Theater, which isn't really a theater, it's a restaurant. Although we didn't eat here, the food must be great because the line is always really long to get in here. As for Janet and I, we made the High Sierra at the beginning of town our hangout spot. And that's where we found ourselves on day 1, planning the hikes for the rest of the week. It's the third day at the west end of Big Bend for us, and we're finally getting out to our first hike. So for our first hike, we decided to do the Chimney Trail. Somewhere out there in the desert are a group of volcanic chimneys with ancient petroglyphs on them that we just have to see. And after a little bit over 2 miles of hiking, we found them. We were told that the chimney on the far left is the one with the petroglyphs. So we decided that that would be the first one we tried to climb. The climb up to the chimney was a little steep, but nothing really hard. And once we got up there, it didn't take us long to find the drawings that we were looking for. I really don't know anything about these drawings, how old they are, who put them here, because the guide didn't really tell us, but they were worth looking at. As we started to make our way around the chimney, we were able to spot the Santa Elena Canyon. If you check out last year's Big Bend video, you'll get some really good pictures of that beautiful canyon. After making our way around that chimney and admiring the view from all sides, it was time to make our way down back to the valley floor. The route we picked for getting back down was a little different than the route we took on the way up. It was a little bit more difficult, a little bit steeper, a little bit slipperier, but it was a whole lot of fun, and you can't really do the same trail twice. So after a little bit of time and a little bit of careful climbing, we finally made our way down, and it was time to look at where we had been and start thinking about climbing around the next chimney in line. The next chimney in line was way bigger, and it was going to take some time if we wanted to explore all sides of this chimney. So time to start climbing the slopes of this chimney, which were way steeper than you might think they were. Climbing these steep slopes took a little bit of effort, and quite often you needed a little bit of a rest before making it all the way to the top. But climbing them was fun, and the view from the top was always way better than the view from the valley floor. Of course, it was important to remember that if you climbed up, you also had to climb down, and sometimes down is harder than up. Gravity, as it turns out, is not always your friend, especially when you're trying to come down a slippery slope covered with crumbly rocks. So easy to slip and fall. But Janet and I have done a few of these, and we're actually getting way better at doing them. The trick for us is to be slow and careful and be methodical about where we plant our feet. But really, we have to climb these things. How else could we find these beautiful formations and check them out? Most of the time, you can't even see these formations from the valley. You have to climb up there just to find them. And so we climb around these things and just look for anything that looks interesting. We were climbing around this thing for the better part of an hour. We found some beautiful rock formations and some plants that were tucked away in the canyon, places that you did not expect anything to be growing. And even when we don't find anything interesting, the walk is still worth it. It keeps us in shape, it keeps us fit. After about an hour of hiking, and before we had to make our way back, we decided to stop for lunch. We always pack in some sandwiches and some water for these hikes because we know we'll need them. And if you're going to stop for lunch, you might as well stop someplace that has a spectacular view. So after enjoying a snack with a view, it was time to make our way back to the car in the mountains in the distance because that's where we left our car. We went back down the same trail that we took to get out here, although you couldn't tell by looking at the scenery around you. It was 9 in the morning when we made our way out here, and none of the flowers on the cactuses had started to open yet. But now, everything was open, and there was color all around us. Another 2 miles of hiking, and we were back at the car and making our way back home again. As we drove home, we talked about those cactuses and how we had never seen so many cactuses all flowering at the same time. It was truly a beautiful walk. And once we got back to the RV and cleaned up, we went down to the High Sierra to have a drink and to plan for tomorrow's hike. On our 4th day at Big Bend, we decided to hike the Blue Creek Trail. Unfortunately, because of a wildfire up in the mountains, this trail was closed. But the Homer Wilson Ranch was at the trailhead of the Blue Creek Trail, and we were permitted to go down and explore it. Of course, most trails in this area have these warning signs. So if I see a mountain lion, I'm going to throw stones and sticks at it. I'm thinking that'll just piss it off. But this one is even better. If I see a black bear, I'm supposed to scare it away. I just don't think the people that wrote these signs understand the dynamics between people and bears, and just who scares who. Well, anyway, we didn't see any bears or lions as we made our way to the ranch. And Janet and I are happy to report that we were thinking about having lunch, not thinking about being lunch. This old abandoned building on the Homer Wilson Ranch was the nicest looking building that I've seen since we've been hiking in the Big Bend area. All the other stone buildings that we've seen looked like they were just kind of thrown together and there wasn't enough room in there to really stretch out. Where all those other buildings looked like they were meant to be temporary, this one has an air of permanence. I mean, it has a decent roof, it has plastered walls, and it has fairly smooth floors. I mean, you can tell the person that built this planned to be here for the long term and planned to be as comfortable as they could possibly be. We enjoyed touring this ranch, but it was time to make our way back up to the car and find someplace to hike today. Our backup plan was the Upper Burro Mesa Pour-Off Trail, which was supposed to be a moderately difficult trail. The trail started with a fairly steep drop to the valley floor below. The first quarter mile of this trail was nice and easy walking across fairly flat terrain. But it didn't take long for this wide open trail to turn into a narrow canyon that just got steeper as we went on. We encountered our first obstacle near the very beginning of this canyon. After making our way down the steep and gravelly path, we came to a drop that must have been 10 feet and took us down to the dry riverbed below. We took some time studying this drop, trying to figure out how we could get down there and make it back up again. Trust me, it looked way more intimidating when we stood there and looked down at this thing than it does on this video. But eventually we figured out that that ledge was the only way to go. The ledge was a bit narrow, but it could be done as long as you did it very carefully. You know how sometimes things look scary, but after you do them, they're not as scary as you first thought? Well, this was one of those things, and I found out that doing it isn't as bad as thinking about doing it. Once I made my way down, it was Janet's turn, and she followed me right on down. Of course, I'm afraid of heights, and she isn't, so it might not have been as hard for her as for me. For those of you thinking I exaggerated 10 feet, Janet is 5 feet tall. And look at this. Well, anyway, from there, it was one steep drop after another. But as long as you were careful and you watched where you planted your feet, none of these were all that difficult, but they were all really interesting. As this trail went on, we just went deeper and deeper and deeper into this canyon, and the canyon itself just kept on getting more narrow. The park guide calls this thing a trail. I'm just not sure that's really the right name for it. I mean, yes, it started as a trail that took us to the mouth of this canyon, but now we're just dropping down through a canyon. This is a dry wash that cut its way through the desert above. And when I say this is a dry wash, I mean to say that this is a dry wash now. It's not always dry. At times, this thing is just pouring with water. If it rains in this area, or if it rains upstream from this area, this canyon turns into a wet torrent. But there's been no rain for a good long time, so we can make our way through this canyon and enjoy its beauty without worrying about drowning. After nearly 2 miles of hiking and less than 100 yards from our goal, we hit the next major roadblock. This was at least a good 40-foot drop, and after checking it out for a good long time, I couldn't find a way to get down there and come back up again. We had come as far as we could possibly go. And even though we couldn't make the last drop, we were happy to have made it all the way down to here. So we sat down at the top of that drop, pulled out some snacks, and got a little rest before we had to turn around and go back to our car. Remember, it was all downhill to make it to this point. Now we have to go up and out of this canyon. It didn't take long for us to reach the very first climb, and it was time to figure out exactly how to do it, because the way we came down is not necessarily the same way you want to go up. We approached this climb the same way we approached all the others. I scouted out ahead and found a path that we could both do. Once I found a way up, it was Janet's turn to make that very same climb. And since she's a little shorter, it tends to be a little harder. But we've been doing this for a while, and both Janet and I are getting pretty good at climbing over these rocks and boulders and making our way through some fairly tough terrain. You know, when we started this trip of ours 5 years ago, I never would have considered us doing any kind of climbing like this. Back then, we were both a little overweight and badly out of shape. Now, this is just routine. Well, anyway, so much for our first up. This is the first of many. I don't really know how many because I don't think I really wanted to count them. But I know we have a whole bunch more to go. The rocks might be a bit difficult to climb, but walking in the sandy bottom of this wash is actually a whole lot harder. The gravel is soft, it constantly gets into your shoes, and walking through it is difficult. It really wears you out, more than climbing over rocks, oddly enough. Once we start seeing the top of the canyon walls, we know we're getting closer to the exit point. But the boulders and the climbs are not going to end soon. Remember, we have about 1.5 miles of constant climbing before we finally get out of this canyon. But just to be clear, we really enjoy climbing through these canyons. It's difficult, it's tiring, but it is so much fun. And I gotta say that this canyon so far has been our favorite climb since we've been down here at Big Bend. And even in these canyon walls, we sometimes find the most beautiful flowers growing straight out of the rock. As this path we're on finally starts to level out, at least a little bit, we know that we're getting close to the end of the canyon and back up onto the desert floor where the climbing or the walking will be easier. And we're finally back at that first obstacle that we encountered on our way down. Time to traverse the ledge, but this time going up, and once we're on top, we will be out of the canyon. After Janet made her way all the way up, it was my turn. And I gotta say, going up was a whole lot easier than coming down. But it was a whole lot more exhausting. After stopping on the ledge and taking one last look at this 10-foot drop and the area around me, it was time for me to get off this ledge, back onto the path, and put this canyon behind us. And so we're finally out of the canyon. We're tired, but at least we're on flat ground, and we still have a good 1/4 mile to go before we get back to the car. This last little bit was an easy walk, and we got a chance to admire some flowering bushes before finally making it back to the car and calling it a day. Now, if any day called for a refreshing drink after a hard day's hike, this was the day. And the best way to plan for tomorrow's hike is obviously over a refreshing drink. Today is a new day, and we decided to continue with the Burrow Mesa pour-off trails. Yesterday, we did the Upper Burrow Mesa Trail. Today, we're doing the Lower Burrow Mesa Trail. The Upper and the Lower Burrow Mesa Trails don't connect. So yesterday, we went as far as we could on the Upper Burrow Mesa Trail, and today we're moving on to the Lower Burrow Mesa Trail and go in as far as we can possibly go. The trail is going to take us into a canyon all the way up to where the pour-off actually is, which, when it rains, is actually one huge waterfall. Again, just as a reminder, it hasn't rained for a very long time, and this trail is now perfectly safe. In order to get a good picture of this pour-off, I did some serious scrambling up the side of this hill. This hill is more like a pile of loose rock, and I'll tell you, it was tricky at best. Really slippery, hard to get good footing. but I was able to get the picture I wanted. Remember this picture from yesterday's hike? If I had been able to make that last drop and the left turn down in the gravel below, I would have ended up right there. Now that would have been a view. So the upper and lower trail don't connect, and this is the reason why. When it rains, this is a spectacular waterfall. Water comes down, pools in the little bowl below, and makes its way down through the canyon. There are lots of these canyons all over Big Bend, and all of them were created by the power of water. So we followed this wash back out through the canyon and back to the car. Since this was such a short hike, we decided to finish our Burrow trifecta with the Burrow Springs Trail. And although this trail wasn't very long either, it was getting rather late in the day and the temperature was really starting to climb. We need to make our way behind this hill and then down through another canyon. So as the temperature starts to climb, we make our way through the desert to find the Burrow Springs. Maybe everybody that came out to this park knew something that we didn't because we were the only ones on this trail. There was nobody in the parking lot. The cactuses in this canyon were blooming, and we noticed that they were not only bigger, but their needles were way bigger than cactuses we saw in other valleys. We were still cleaning rocks out of our shoes, and the heat was getting serious. It was good to know that there was nobody in front of us as we walked this trail. And eventually we made it as far as we could possibly go. Again, we met an obstacle that we could not overcome. So again, it was time for another wonderful lunch with a wonderful view. That's another great thing about these hikes. Halfway Point always seems to be a great place for lunch with a view. We also found this cave. I'm thinking that there is at least one bear out here that knows how to build a wall. I guess he's smarter than the average bear, boo-boo. But it's time to climb our way out of this bear den. This last part right here was the last part we had to climb to get down to the point where we could go no further. And even this part was rather difficult, and we had to think about it before we actually went down this thing. And after Janet made it to the top, it was my turn to make the climb and get out of this hole. This was really the hardest part of this hike, and we knew that once we got out of here, we were fine all the way back. From here, the only thing that was going to make this hike difficult was the heat. But that was no concern. We had plenty of water and only about 1.5 miles to go before we made it back to the car. And after about half an hour of walking, we were back at the car having finished our Burrow trifecta. The upper, the lower, and the Burrow Springs. So this time after the hike, we decided to relax at a local coffee shop. I had a cup of iced coffee and Janet had a Coke. See, we don't just drink alcohol. Another day and another trail, and today it's the Ward Springs Trail. Ward Springs was listed as a moderate trail, and it's sitting right there in the mountains behind us. We set off to find Ward Springs by following an old pipeline that was laid back in the early 1900s by the ranchers to bring water from Ward Springs all the way down into the valley in order to water their livestock. For the most part, this trail was pretty flat. Instead of trying to take us up and over the hills, it took us around them. But as we got further in, we finally had to start going up and over the hills. Compared to some of the other trails we did, these hills weren't bad. Some of them might have been as steep as others that we took before, but at least they weren't long. They were short and they ended quickly. As we got closer and closer to the spring, the vegetation changed. The brown of the desert was replaced by the green of trees that obviously had enough water year-round out here in the desert. We did find some of the spring, but it's hard to believe that they consider this drinking water. We hiked up and above the spring, and Janet had to check out the map just to make sure we were in the right place. Me, I just took a break and enjoyed the view. After we verified that we were in fact at the right place, we sat down and decided this was a great place for lunch. We always do enjoy lunch with a view as we go hiking these mountains. Somewhere along the way, Janet got way too close to a cactus and picked up a few needles in her leg. I needed to give her a hand and pluck those needles out one by one. Once we finished our lunch and made sure that Janet was needle-free, it was time to make our way back down and back to our car. The trip back always seems easier than the trip out, and it's not that it's always downhill. In this case, we were going up and down the hills all the way back to the car, just like we did coming out. But we know the way, and we know how far we have to go, so it just seems easier and shorter. Anyway, after about an hour of hiking to make it back to our car, we finally got to the flats, and once we hit the flats, we knew that the car was just around the corner. So from here, an easy walk to the car, an easy drive back to the RV, and we put another great day of hiking behind us over here at Big Bend. Since this was our last hike at Big Bend, we felt that it, above all others, warranted a celebratory drink. Once we were adequately refreshed, we decided to take one last look around town before packing up the RV and moving on to our next location. We took another brief look at this old cemetery going back well over 100 years. We took a look at some of the many old cars around this town, and some of them looked like they've been abandoned and just sitting there for years. We looked at some old abandoned farm equipment along the side of the road, although how anybody could farm out here, I still don't know. And finally, we got a close-up look at some local artwork just sitting on a concrete pad alongside the road. But finally, our trip is over, and although we had a lot of fun here at Terralingua, it's time to pack up and move on. So we're still in Texas and plan to be for the near future, so we won't be adding any new states to our list, at least not just yet. So for now, it's time to hit the road, and I hope we'll see you at our next stop.